In the summer of 1934, Michael King Sr., lead pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church, left on a whirlwind trip to Rome, Tunisia, Egypt, Jerusalem, and Bethlehem before setting sail for Germany. King arrived in Berlin, Germany, just a year after Adolf Hitler had become chancellor, and all around him he saw the rise of Nazi Germany and the hatred growing against Jewish men and women. While in Germany, he learned more about the monk and theologian Martin Luther, who in 1517 had nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church, helping launch the Protestant Revolution. This tour of Germany had a profound impact on Michael, and when he returned home, he changed his own name and the name of his then 5-year-old son, who would become Martin Luther King Jr. Like so many of you, I grew up knowing about Martin Luther King Jr. for one very important reason. His birthday got me an extra day off from school every year, and a Monday at that. Obviously, I knew that Martin Luther King Jr. was an important figure. I think at some point I began to even understand that he had done a lot to fight against discrimination and to help advance the civil rights movement of the 1960s. But that was decades before I was born. As a young boy in Ohio, I didn't know a single person of color, and I naively thought that all that racism stuff was in the past. Clearly, I had a lot to learn. In the years since, I have slowly learned more and more about the pastor who was born Michael King Jr., and in recent history, I've tried to learn as much as I possibly can about him, his beliefs, his work, and his impact. I've read his own writings and his own journals. I've read writings about him, letters to him. I've listened to his sermons, watched his speeches, and come to the conclusion that while he was far from perfect, he was one of the few people to walk this planet in a way that Hebrews 11:38 truly applies to. He was a man of whom this world simply was not worthy. Today is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day, an annual holiday that we've set aside to remember this great pastor and the impact that he made. As we remember him today, I want to direct our focus specifically to the sacrifices he was willing to make in order to do the work God had called him to do. And just to be clear, when I say sacrifice, what I'm talking about are those times where we give up something that is valuable to us in order to benefit someone else. Martin Luther King Jr. had a very normal, for the times, childhood growing up in the South. Writing about his own childhood, he said, "There was a pretty strict system of segregation in Atlanta. For a long, long time, I could not go swimming until there was a Negro YMCA. A Negro child in Atlanta could not go to any public park. I could not go to the so-called white schools. In many of the stores downtown, I couldn't go to a lunch counter to buy a hamburger or a cup of coffee. I could not attend any of the theaters. There were 1 or 2 Negro theaters, but they didn't get any of the main pictures. And if they did get them, they got them 2 or 3 years later." This was life in the so-called separate but equal world of the 1940s. Without doubt, it was certainly separate and certainly not equal. In every way imaginable, people of color were discriminated against, and it was an everyday reality. Discrimination against the black population had reached into even the most subtle parts of American culture. Growing up, Dr. King made the following observation: "Even semantics conspire to make that which is black seem ugly and degrading." In Roget's thesaurus, there are some 120 synonyms for blackness, and at least 60 of them are offensive. Such words as blot, soot, grime, devil, and foul. There are some 134 synonyms for whiteness, and all of them are favorable, expressed in such words as purity, cleanliness, chastity, and innocence. A white lie is better than a black lie. The most degenerate member of a family is the black sheep, not the white sheep. In his autobiography, he talks about the common occurrence of being the recipient of racism. Just one example was when he wrote this: When I was about 8 years old, I was in one of the downtown stores in Atlanta, and all of a sudden someone slapped me, and the only thing I heard was somebody saying, "You're that blank that stepped on my foot." Person was not the word she had used. Experiences like this had an impact on young Martin. How could they not? Even as a young boy, he realized how horrible these experiences would make anyone feel about themselves. He said that they make you feel like you're not as good, that you are dirty or dumb, that you're worthless. But Martin's father did not take the racism his family faced lightly. And he taught Martin Jr. that it was never okay, that he was just as good as any other person, that he was intelligent, that he was gifted, and that God had a purpose for him and for his life. Martin would prove his father right. He did extremely well in school. In fact, he was invited to skip both the 9th and the 12th grades. As a teenager, Martin's faith became his own, and he later wrote about his thinking as he considered college. As a young man, with most of my life ahead of me, I decided early to give my life to something eternal and absolute, not to these little gods that are here today and gone tomorrow, but to God who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. At the age of 15, he left for Morehouse College, where he would earn his bachelor's degree in sociology. Then he went to Crozer Theological Seminary for his divinity degree before finishing his studies at Boston University, where he earned his doctorate in systematic theology, becoming Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. By this time, Martin was married to his wife, Coretta Scott, and he had a decision to make where he and his wife would live and what type of work he would choose to do. On one hand, Martin had job offers from multiple universities in the Northeast. On the other hand, a church in Montgomery, Alabama had offered him the job of being their senior pastor. The university jobs were no doubt very appealing. If he chose to go that route, he would make more money, hold a more prestigious position. He would probably work fewer hours, spend more time with his family, and maybe best of all, he would be able to pontificate on the evils of Southern racism from the relative comfort and safety of academia in the North. About this decision, he wrote, "I found that my wife was also hesitant to return south. We discussed the all-important question of raising children in the bonds of segregation. We reviewed our own growth in the South and the many advantages we had been deprived of as a result of segregation. The question of my wife's musical career came up. She was certain that a northern city would afford a greater opportunity for continued study than any city in the Deep South. For several days, we talked and thought and prayed over each of these matters. Finally, we agreed. In spite of the disadvantages and inevitable sacrifices, our greatest service could be rendered in our native South. We came to the conclusion that we had something of a moral obligation to return, at least for a few years." And so, on October 31st, 1954, Martin became the pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. It was just barely 1 year later when a Montgomery woman named Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat in the black section of a bus to a white man. The arrest made news quickly, and 4 days later, an organization called the Montgomery Improvement Association was formed, electing Martin as its first president. That group would go on to form a black boycott of the city buses and organized a ride-sharing program to help people get where they needed to go. Thousands responded, crippling the bus system due to the lack of use and funds that normally came from those bus fares. The city leaders and police officers did not respond well. In mid-January, while driving home from church, Martin picked up some walkers to give them a ride, and he noticed 2 police officers pull up behind him on motorcycles. Being extremely cautious to obey every single traffic law, he was nonetheless pulled over for speeding, arrested, and taken to jail. He later recalled, "After depositing my things and giving the jailer the desired information, I was led to a dingy and odorous cell As the big iron door swung open, the jailer said to me, "All right, get on in there with all the others." From the moment, strange gusts of emotion swept through me like cold winds on an open prairie. For the first time in my life, I was thrown behind bars. This may have been the first time that Dr. King was thrown behind bars, but it would not be the last. In fact, over the next 13 years, he would be arrested some 29 times. 29 times. The abuse and violence that Dr. King and his family would endure was just beginning. He writes, "Almost immediately after the protests started, we had begun to receive threatening telephone calls and letters. They increased as time went on. By the middle of January, they had risen to 30 or 40 a day." Can you imagine getting 30 to 40 threatening letters and phone calls every single day? It's important to know that these were not empty threats either. On January 30th, while he was speaking at a gathering, his wife and children were at home, and his home was bombed. Luckily, his family survived, but it's almost impossible for us to fully understand what this man and his family went through in order to help end a system of injustice and oppression. That boycott lasted 382 days until December 21st, 1956, when the Supreme Court of the United States declared the laws requiring segregation on buses to be unconstitutional. Shortly after the Supreme Court ruling, Martin gave a speech in Brooklyn, New York, where he said this: "Christ showed us the way, and Gandhi in India showed us it could work." He was referencing the fact that Mahatma Gandhi had done in India to help bring about racial equality there in the years leading up to Dr. King beginning his work. They had won in Montgomery, and the foundation had been laid for his commitment to ending oppression through nonviolence. Shortly thereafter, King and others founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He was made president of that new organization that was committed to taking the blueprint for success that they had developed in Montgomery to other cities where oppression and injustice ran rampant. He developed a 4-step system which he would leverage again and again and again. He described this system in a letter he wrote from a solitary confinement jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama. In any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 basic steps: collection of the facts to determine whether injustices exist, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. You may well ask, why direct action? Why the sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks to dramatize the issue so that it can no longer be ignored. In the 11-year period between Montgomery and the end of his life, King traveled over 6 million miles and spoke over 2,500 times, appearing wherever there was injustice and systemic racism. Through it all, he faced abuse like we can only imagine, but he kept going because he had a dream that he was driven to see fulfilled. He spoke about this dream on numerous occasions, but the most famous by far was when he spoke about it on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in front of some 250,000 people during the March on Washington in 1963. During that event, King gave a 17-minute speech, but the most famous part of it by far was when he departed from his prepared notes after a woman standing behind him yelled, "Tell him about your dream." King did. And here is a 5-minute clip of that speech.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is a faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, my country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the heightening Alleghanies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring. And when this happens, and when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
As his influence grew, so did the opposition to him and his work. In addition to those 29 arrests, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. bore the brunt of countless acts of violence, discrimination, and hate. In 1958, while he was signing books in Harlem, New York, a woman plunged a 7-inch long letter opener into his chest. The tip of the blade came to rest right alongside his aorta, and King underwent hours of delicate emergency surgery. Surgeons would later tell him that just one sneeze or sharp movement could have punctured his aorta and killed him. It was from his hospital bed where he was confined for a number of weeks where King issued a statement affirming his nonviolent principles and saying he felt no ill will towards his attacker. Through his organization, the SCLC, King ended up working to eradicate systemic race-based injustice in Albany, Birmingham, Selma, Los Angeles, New York City, and several other cities. I don't have anywhere near enough time to unpack all of those situations, but none of them were easy, and all of them required significant sacrifices from Dr. King and his family. As difficult as those experiences were, maybe the hardest was when he was asked to help address the racist housing policies in Chicago. He writes of that time, "My concern for the welfare of Negroes in the North was no less than that for the Negroes in the South. And my conscience dictated that I should commit as much of my personal and organizational resources to their cause as was humanly possible." And so, in 1966, King moved to the city of Chicago. Living in Chicago, though, was no small sacrifice. Of the experience, he later wrote, "We were met with massive violence when we marched into certain areas. We suffered in the process of trying to dramatize the issues when we marched into all-white areas that denied us access to houses and where real estate agents would not allow us to see the listings. Bottles and bricks were thrown at us. We were often beaten. Some of the people who had been brutalized in Selma and who were present in Montgomery led marches in the suburbs of Chicago amid a rain of rocks and bottles, among burning automobiles, to the thunder of jeering thousands, many of them waving Nazi flags. Swastikas bloomed in the Chicago parks like misbegotten weeds. Our marches were met by a hailstorm of bricks, bottles, and firecrackers." He says, "I've been in many demonstrations all across the South, but I can say that I have never seen, even in Mississippi, mobs as hostile and as hate-filled as in Chicago." Records show that Martin Luther was literally stoned as he walked the streets of Chicago. And then, on top of the sacrifice of abuse to his physical body, the city's leaders came along and threatened him with a legal injunction, hoping that the threat of jail time would prevent him from leading any more marches. Clearly, they did not know Martin Luther King Jr. very well, and he addressed their threat of more jail time in a speech he gave called "Why I Must March." I want to play a 1-minute clip from that speech for you. Take a listen.
I just want to warn the city that it would be an act of folly in the midst of seeking to negotiate a solution to this problem to go seek an injunction, because if they don't know it, we are veteran jail goers. For us, jails are not dungeons of shame. They are havens of freedom and human dignity. I've been to jail in Alabama. I've been to jail in Florida. I've been to jail in Georgia. I've been to jail in Mississippi. I've been to jail in Virginia, and I'm ready to go to jail in Chicago.
After Chicago, Martin continued to work tirelessly on behalf of the oppressed, and the sacrifices he made continued. The hatred he received, the letters and threatening phone calls, the acts of violence. His home was bombed a second time. One of the things that he talks about in his autobiography is the enormous sacrifice that it was to spend so much time away from his wife and 4 kids. And of course, we all know that in 1968, he paid the ultimate sacrifice. In April of that year, he went to Memphis, Tennessee, in order to support a strike by the city's black sanitation workers. And in a speech on the night before his assassination, he told an audience at the Mason Temple Church, "Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity does have its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." It was almost prophetic, speaking about not getting to the promised land with his listeners. The very next day, as he was prepared to go to dinner with a local pastor, he was shot and killed. He was 39 years old. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. made an impact that we are still feeling today. The legacy that he left behind, the advances he achieved on behalf of so many others, and the importance of the work that he started cannot be overstated. But it did not come without tremendous sacrifice. And you have to wonder, how was he able to do it? How was he able to make those sacrifices? How could he endure that much abuse, that much violence? How could he absorb the racism that was thrown at him every single day? Death threats, beatings, 29 arrests, multiple bombings. What was it that drove him to never quit? There are countless numbers of people who have made sacrifices throughout history, and they've made those sacrifices for a wide range of reasons. But there is absolutely no doubt why Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was able to sacrifice so much. For him, it was all because of his faith in Jesus Christ. Everything he did, everything he accomplished, all of the sacrifices he made, it was all motivated and it was all sustained by his faith in Jesus. I think we have to be careful today to not rewrite history by making Martin Luther King Jr. simply a civil rights leader. He was not just a civil rights leader, he was a pastor. He was a pastor, not a politician. The foundation of his life was his faith in Jesus. He believed with everything in him that Jesus is the Son of God and that Jesus came in order to show us how to live in relationship with God and with each other. Dr. King looked around at the country that he loved just 50 years ago, and he saw the massive racism that violated everything Jesus taught about loving our neighbor as ourselves and about laying down our lives for one another. And he knew deep in his heart that he had to do something about it. It was a moral imperative. His faith would not allow him to sit on the sidelines and watch the hatred continue unchecked. He had been filled with the love of Christ, and that love drove him to help bring God's kingdom to earth. That love gave him the strength to make the hard sacrifices that he made. And he believed that true Christianity calls all of us to be willing to do the same. Look at what he said in one of his sermons. Honesty impels me to admit that transformed nonconformity, which is always costly and never altogether comfortable, may mean walking through the valley of the shadow of suffering, losing a job, or having a 6-year-old daughter ask you, Daddy, why do you have to go to jail so much? But we are gravely mistaken to think that Christianity protects us from the pain and agony of mortal existence. Christianity has always insisted that the cross we bear precedes the crown we wear. To be a Christian, one must take up his cross with all of its difficulties and agonizing and tragedy-packed content and carry it until that very cross leaves its marks upon us and redeems us to that more excellent way that comes only through suffering. To be a Christian, one must take up his cross. That's such a hard challenge. But that challenge does not come from Martin Luther King Jr. It comes from Jesus. Dr. King was simply reminding his church what Jesus said in Mark chapter 8. You might remember what happened in Mark chapter 8. Jesus was nearing the end of his ministry. And one day he decided to tell his disciples that they were going to head for Jerusalem, and that when they got there, he would be arrested, tried, and put to death. Peter, who was one of Jesus' 12 disciples, did not want to hear any of that. So he objected, and he actually pulled Jesus off to the side of the road to scold Jesus. He was like, Jesus, come on, man, don't go there. Nobody wants to hear any of that. Don't go negative. Don't talk about anybody taking your life. Nobody's going to be able to do that. You're the Messiah. He's like, Jesus, things are going so well. Don't start talking about sacrifices and death. Come on now. Look at how Jesus responded to Peter. But when Jesus turned around and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. Get behind me, Satan, he said. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. Peter, he was saying, you don't want me to talk about death because it's not good for you. But you're not actually interested in what God wants or what God's doing. What you care about is what's good for you. And then Jesus called the crowd to him along with his disciples, and he said, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Jesus is the one who said, if you want to follow me, you must take up your cross. And you have to understand that this was heard very differently in Jesus' day than it is for us today. For us today, a cross is a bit of a decoration. It's a necklace or earrings. Look, Jesus, I've taken up my cross by getting a cross tattoo on my back where no one will see it, even me. We've romanticized the cross. But in Jesus' day, they saw people hanging from the cross. They knew the blood of a cross. They knew the smell of walking by a cross. They knew the horrifying screams that came from people dying on crosses. The cross was an instrument of death. And Jesus said, if you would come after me, you must deny yourself and you must die to what you think is best for your life if you want to truly follow me. I don't know about you, but this is the part of our faith that I would prefer to simply ignore. And that's easy to do because there are a lot of benefits to being a follower of Jesus. If you've been a follower of Jesus for any amount of time, you know what I'm talking about. There are a lot of benefits to following him, to doing life the way Jesus taught us to do life. When you base your life on the biblical principles, it saves you from a lot of unnecessary pain that other people who aren't living according to biblical principles find themselves in. When you're quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to get angry, that has a positive impact on your relationships. It serves you well. When you're generous financially, it breaks the chains of greed and materialism on your heart, and you feel more free. It serves you well. When you have conflict with someone and you follow Jesus' teaching in Matthew 18 about conflict resolution, where instead of talking about them to everyone behind their back, you go directly to them and you have a one-on-one conversation with them to clear it up and you're quick to forgive them, that serves you well. There are a ton of benefits to following Jesus, but we have to remember that Jesus also calls us to lay down our lives as a living sacrifice to Him. Following Jesus brings God's blessing on our lives, but we are not here only to be blessed. We have been given a job to do. We have been called to be a blessing to others. We have been called to look not only to our own interests, but also to the interests of others. We have been called to carry each other's burdens. We have been called to rebuild that which has been broken. We have been called to give dignity to those who have been demeaned. We have been called to lift high those who have been pushed low. We have been called to see those who feel invisible. We have been called to hear those who go unheard, to speak for those who don't have voices. We have been called to build bridges where there are divides, racial divides and gender divides and political divides, religious divides and economic divides. We have been called to help bring heaven to earth, but we can't do that when we are completely absorbed in our own little world. And so maybe it's time that we start praying a prayer that sounds like Dr. King's. Maybe it's time that we ask God to stretch us and to grow us and to take us to places in our life that we've never been and where we're afraid to go because we know it will cost us something. When we get to heaven, none of us want to look around and think to ourselves, gosh, I made it here, but now I see how much I prioritized my own personal safety and comfort above everything else. No, we want to simply see God and hear Him say, "Well done, my good and faithful servant. You served me with your life, not yourself. So come, receive your reward." Let's be people who live lives of sacrifice, even a fraction of the way Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. did. And in doing so, let's help bring heaven to earth for more people.